Hi, this is Troy Tacey from Fordham University, and this is the third of my video presentations on the coronavirus outbreak in the US and around the world. So what we're going to be talking about in this short video is the concept of herd immunity. So herd immunity, what is it? So as we saw in the previous video, an epidemic depends on susceptible individuals to grow. And in that previous video, we also defined this thing called the reproduction number, or R. And R is equal to the number of contacts, the average number of contacts that people in a population have, multiplied by the probability of a transmission occurring when an infective person comes in contact with a susceptible person, multiplied by the fraction of susceptible people in the population, multiplied by the duration of an infection. So how long does someone remain infective once they are infected with the virus? And what we saw is that if R is bigger than 1, then the epidemic is going to grow. If R is less than 1, then the epidemic is going to shrink. So herd immunity is this idea that if we take this reproduction number and we can somehow make S small enough so that we don't have enough susceptible people in the population, we can drive R to be below 1. Then if an infectious disease enters a population, R is small enough that it won't spread widely within that population. So the idea of herd immunity is we make S, if S is small enough, the epidemic can't take hold in the population and it can't spread widely. Now, the most common way to create herd immunity is through vaccines. So vaccines move people in the SIR model that we've been working with from the susceptible population to the immune population without them having to pass through the infective state where they can infect other people. Now, in order to get herd immunity, again, we need R to be less than 1. Again, R is equal to the contact rate multiplied by the transmission rate multiplied by the duration multiplied by the fraction of susceptible people in the population. So we need that product to be less than 1. So if we just rearrange the right-hand side of this inequality, what we see is we need S to be less than 1 over C times T times D, and we previously referred to this product, C times T times D, as the initial reproduction number, or R0, or also sometimes called R0. So if S is less than 1 over this initial reproduction number, we can create herd immunity because there won't be enough susceptible people in the population to allow that epidemic to spread. So what that means then is we need to vaccinate 1 minus 1 over R0 people, and that is what gives us herd immunity. Now, as a quick example, we saw in a previous video that the reproduction number for measles is estimated to be between 12 and 18. So just to keep things simple, let's take the average of this, which is 15. If we want to create herd immunity for measles, what we have to do is vaccinate 1 minus 1 over 15, or 93% of the population. So if we get 93% of the population to take the measles vaccine, then we create herd immunity, and we shouldn't see any cases of measles unless they're introduced into say a small closed population that happens to not be vaccinated. Another example, influenza. So the reproduction number for influenza, as we saw in the previous video, was about 2 to 3. So again, let's just take the average, do the same calculation, and what we see is we need about 60% of the population to be vaccinated effectively against influenza in order to create herd immunity. So if we have 60% effectively vaccinated, then we wouldn't expect to see influenza in the population. Now, a key thing here that I emphasize is this word effectively. Now, with something like the measles vaccine, as long as you get your 2 doses, it's a very effective vaccine. You gain almost 100% immunity if you get your 2 doses of the measles vaccine, as is recommended when you're a child. Influenza isn't as effective of a vaccine. Typically the influenza vaccine is significantly less than 1. The effectiveness varies from year to year depending on what strains circulate, what exactly is in the influenza vaccine. And if we account for the effectiveness being less than 1, it is believed that we would actually need to get about 3/4 to 4/5 of the population to be vaccinated in order to reach herd immunity within the US. So even though we get 60% up here, we need to take account of the fact that we need these people, we need a little bit bigger number than this because the vaccine for influenza isn't 100% effective. So I'm going to take a moment to sort of jump up on a soapbox, and I haven't done this elsewhere in the videos, and I don't believe I'll do it later on either. But one of the things that is certainly in the popular press recently is that the CDC attributes an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 deaths each year from influenza. And again, we need about 75 to 80% of people to get their flu shots each year to reach herd immunity for influenza. So if you think about the concept of herd immunity, if we get 4 out of 5 people in the US to get their flu shots, that's going to eliminate most of those 30,000 to 40,000 deaths that we see in the US each year just from influenza. So currently in a typical year, less than 1/2 of the population is vaccinated. Most of the deaths that we see are from elderly people, and those are also the people for whom the influenza vaccine is least effective. So these are the people that depend upon young, healthy people to get their flu shots so that they stop the influenza virus from spreading. Right? Another thing to think about for a moment, again, up on my soapbox, is this is one reason that influenza is a bad comparison for the current coronavirus outbreak. We don't have a vaccine. So when people say something like the coronavirus outbreak, well, it's just like the flu, therefore we shouldn't worry about it. We have to remember that we have usually between 40 to 50% of the US population vaccinated against influenza, yet it still creates 30 to 40,000 deaths. We don't have a vaccine, so even if the coronavirus outbreak is just the flu, it's still going to be a big problem because we don't have that buffer of 40 to 50% of the population vaccinated. Okay, so off the soapbox, let's get back to the model we've been working with. So I'm going to pull back onto the screen the SIR model that we've been working with. And again, we've got this contact times transmission rate equal to 1/2. We've got 1/d equal to 1/4. And what we see is this typical outbreak that we've been working with. And what I want us to imagine now is that we incorporate into this model some number of people that are vaccinated. So I'm working with a population of 8 million people, which is roughly the population of New York City. And let's suppose that we start, again, the epidemic with 1 infected person. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start vaccinating people, and we'll see what happens to this epidemic. So if we vaccinate, say, 1/8 of the population, we see that the epidemic gets a little bit smaller. Right? Go back to 0, epidemic is bigger. So let's suppose we vaccinate 2 million people. Again, we get a much, much smaller epidemic and far fewer people that are infected over the entire course of the epidemic. If we go up to 3 million people, we see that the epidemic gets really, really small. And then finally, if we go all the way up to 4 million people, what we see is the epidemic never takes off, right? We sit with the number of infections right along the horizontal axis at 0. And if we think about the parameters that we have over here, we hit this point of herd immunity exactly where we would expect. So we need to vaccinate 1 minus C times T times D. So we need to vaccinate 1/2 of the population in order to reach herd immunity. And we see the epidemic disappears exactly when we put in 4 million people being vaccinated out of the 8 million people. Okay, so where are we going to go next? We know what a typical epidemic looks like. We know about the reproduction number. We know how that influences what happens in the epidemic. We know what the formula for calculating the reproduction number is. We also know about herd immunity. So the next place that we're going to go is something that has been in the news an awful lot lately, which is this thing called flattening the curve. So we're going to talk about what flattening the curve means. We're going to talk about how we use social distancing in order to flatten the curve, or how do we achieve flattening the curve through this idea of social distancing. And one of the things that is going to be difficult, perhaps, to understand briefly is that even if we flatten the curve, we're still going to see an exponential run-up in the number of new infections and the spread of the outbreak. So the tricky part to get people to understand will be that even if we do social distancing, unless we look at the numbers in the right way, it'll be difficult to tell if social distancing has been effective. But if we look at the numbers in the right way, it's going to be easy to tell relatively quickly and without any advanced statistics at all if we've actually flattened the curve and if we've had an impact on the epidemic spreading. So what we'll try to do is show you very, very quickly with looking at just a couple simple graphs, as long as we look at them in the right way, whether or not social distancing has had an effect. And we should actually be able to see that about a week from now is my prediction, that if social distancing is having an effect, we'll know within a week or so.